It's pretty clear it was sabotage. And I think that, the theory that Nikolai Patrushev, the Kremlin advisor, longtime Kremlin advisor to Putin, was most likely the one who gave the green light to that.
Probably the closest that anyone has come to toppling Vladimir Putin, that we know of anyway, was the Russian mercenary Yevgeny Prigozhin, who, as leader of the Wagner Group, marched his troops on Moscow 16 months after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. For more on that and the wider picture of Russia's relationship with mercenaries hired to protect the Kremlin from direct responsibility for their actions, I'm pleased to say that the author of Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group, and Russia's collapse into mercenary chaos, Candace Rondeaux, joins us on Times Radio now. A warm welcome. Thanks for coming in to see us. Would you agree with that assessment, Candace, that Prigozhin is the closest we've seen as a real threat to Vladimir Putin?
Indeed, I would say Prigozhin is a historical figure. He came within a couple hundred miles of nearly toppling Putin's regime, and he really upset the apple cart when it came to just the political order of the day, challenging Putin on every kind of level, not just militarily, because I think we can see that he didn't win when it came to the military challenge, but politically he was a potential threat, and I think Putin perceived that, although a bit too late, unfortunately for him. And he had a lot of allies within the military who backed the Wagner Group, backed the aggressive nature of the Wagner Group, and wanted to see Putin run the war differently. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out for Prigozhin, though.
Let's set some context here then and talk about how Prigozhin came to be so riled up as head of the Wagner Group that he was intent on proving a point to Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I think there were two motivations for Prigozhin. One was simply just he was always the entrepreneur, always the adventurer. He had a huge ego, dating back to when he was a kid. He wanted to be an Olympic champion. He had always...
Of what?
Of cross-country skiing, actually, of all things. And actually, that probably started his life of crime. He actually allegedly had an accident while training as a young man, and that lamed him up and led him to a life of crime. He had a huge ego, and everybody knew this about him. He always had delusions of grandeur, but I think some of the victories that he chalked up early in the war in 2022, particularly in Soledar, and then later Bakhmut was a big motivation. Polls said that he could replace Putin. Polls said that maybe he could replace Sergei Shogun, then the Minister of Defense. So he was very puffed up. And when the ammo did not arrive on time during this tremendous battle, 10 months long on the front lines of Bakhmut, he called it the meat grinder, and there was just destruction all around him, especially his own guys. I think he went mad. I think he had a kind of Colonel Kurtz Apocalypse Now moment, and really felt that he was owed something. And I think the destruction was something that he hadn't been exposed to. This was his first time really on the front lines. All those other years, Syria, Central African Republic, Libya, he was sort of a distant sort of CEO. But that piece, the Bakhmut piece, I think drove him quite out of his mind. And then there was the constant rivalry with Sergei Shoigu over sort of who should get credit for victories on the battlefield.
Yeah, and he felt that he'd been isolated or left alone by the Kremlin while they were, arming up their own soldiers as a mercenary group operating on behalf of the Kremlin. They felt isolated, didn't they? And they also engaged in very dirty war, something that they would have felt was essential to winning the war in Ukraine. There were no delicate battle plans. This was, as you say, the meat grinder. Yeah,
I mean, that's the contrast. And I think that's what was so interesting about Prigozhin, just as a historical figure, as a political figure. He did things that, Russian generals could only dream of. He excited people to join the front line, of course, including prisoners who maybe had no choice, but still, he was able to mobilize people to the front line in ways that not even Putin was able to do. And he did that through symbology. Sledgehammer was a big symbol. He did that through extreme aggression, and he was a master of social media marketing. And he really employed that, I think, to his benefit.
He directly criticised, particularly Sergei Shogun, the defence minister, on social media openly. In fact, I can remember at the time looking at those posts and thinking, how is this guy getting away with it? And indeed, people were puzzled at the time as to how he was able to express that level of dissent against Shogun, and therefore, by reference, Putin as well, effectively, how he was able to get away with that for so long. What hold did he have over Putin, or was Putin happy to distance himself from it?
Well, Putin's style has always been to play rivals off against each other. And I think we certainly saw that in the first year of the war, particularly, as we rounded the corner into 2023, spring of 2023. We had a, constant change of leadership on the battlefield. We also saw Shoigu, of course, faltering, Gerasimov faltering. And these were supposed to be the geniuses of, Russian military doctrine and strategy. And what Prigozhin showed was actually you just need bodies and you just need a will. And
brute force.
A brute force, which I don't think Putin was inclined to get in the way of. However, there were people close to him, like Nikolai Patrushev, his longtime advisor in the Kremlin, who I think feared that Putin had unwittingly created a Frankenstein in Wagner.
Let's talk more about how the Wagner Group came to be. Mercenary groups were used by the Kremlin to do their dirty work. Non-official ways of the Kremlin being able to say, well, it's nothing to do with us, it isn't our responsibility, all the while everyone complicit in the fact that they were being stockpiled by the Kremlin. But they allowed the Kremlin to break international law freely, effectively. How did the Wagner Group come to be?
Well, the Wagner Group was yet another Putin gamble. On a strategy that was sort of handed to him by some of his closest advisors in the GRU, where they used proxies. At first, it was sort of these Russian separatists who had sort of mixed loyalties in Donbass. But what Prigozhin offered was something a little bit more vicious. Importantly, he offered a solution in the summer of 2014 to what was chaos. If you might remember, after the MH17 downing of the Malaysian airjet, it was just full-on chaos in Donbass. And Putin was keen to remove the people that had created one of the greatest diplomatic incidents, certainly of his rule. And Prigozhin helped him do that with the help of course, Dmitry Utkin, who's, of course, the namesake of the Wagner Group, assassinating Russian separatists who were getting in the way, taking care of business, basically. It was their success there that led them to then expand the remit to go into Syria. Now, of course, they'd already been in Syria in a smaller format, but when they returned to Syria in 2015, that's when they really became what we know today as the Wagner Group. Before that, they were just yet another experiment. They were called Battalion Group V, just one of many that was sort of let out there. But it was the shell game and Prigozhin's magical ability to launder money and to sort of make things move and disappear and then suddenly reappear on the battlefield, I think, that won the day.
How did Putin and Prigozhin first meet? How did they come across each other?
Well, Putin always used to say he didn't know anything about him until years later. They used to lie about it, of course. The reality is they met in the 1990s, early 1990s. They used to call it the Wild 90s in St. Petersburg. That's when I went to school there, actually.
Did you?
Yeah, it was wild. It was a time of mafia, casinos. I mean, sort of.
So you grew up there?
Well, no, I didn't grow up there. I spent my final year of college there.
Okay.
As an exchange student. I was living in sort of grubby dormitory, actually not that far from where Putin had an apartment, where Prigozhin also had an apartment. I didn't know anything about that.
I was about to ask you if you had any sense at the time of the relevance of what was going on around you, the very foundations, really, of what we see of Putin's government, the way he rules his country.
Well, look, I grew up in Chicago, which is Mafia City. It's the home of Al Capone. And one thing I did recognize at the time was the mafia was deeply in control of that city and certainly of the country. And, you know, to the extent that Putin was somehow sort of reflective of that, the mesh between the mafia and the security agencies at that time, I think that was certainly redolent throughout the city. And it's that mix between the mafia, the security agencies, and also a lot of veterans who were coming home from Afghanistan who were out of work, dope sick, drunk, you know, really out of sorts. That mesh was everywhere apparent. And I think ultimately that is sort of the magical mix that made the Wagner Group not just a mercenary paramilitary group, but also a social movement. That sort of meshing between sort of disaffected men who were out of power and out of sorts, I think was really kind of the core of what pulled them all together.
Became almost sort of cult-like, that sort of wanting to belong, wanting to find a place, wanting to find your power again, I suppose, if you've come off the front line. Putin was an agent at that time?
Well, that's a funny story. So Putin said that he had quit the KGB and that he was a taxi driver. And at this time, by the way, Prigozhin was just getting out of prison after a 9-year stint in prison for what they called thuggery at the time, a lot of assaults and robberies. So here comes, you know, Prigozhin out of prison and Putin supposedly out of the KGB after a stint in East Germany. He said that he, you know, had quit, but in reality he was still on the take, still getting funding from the KGB, taking his salary. He joined the political council of the then mayor, Anatoly Sobchak, and became his key advisor, really became his key fixer. And that's how he got to know Prigozhin.
And was their relationship good the whole way through? I mean, how did they interact with each other? Because you've got two very, I don't know, would you describe them as, I suppose the way that they approach things was differently, but kind of with the same ultimate outcome. How would you describe the mix of them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anybody really knows the true story of their relationship. I will say, I think one thing that Putin appreciated was that Prigozhin surrounded himself with very powerful people. He was always, you know, at the elbow of powerful oligarchs, powerful, you know, security agents, politicians, and he did not blab. He did not tell secrets. I think he kept it very buttoned up. He was very discreet with information that he was privy to, simply because essentially he was Putin's chef. I think Putin really appreciated that. I think he also...
We should expand on that, by the way. He actually was.
He was indeed.
He basically catered huge functions, didn't he? Did he have a hot dog franchise?
Yes. And I have a theory that I probably have eaten some of those hot dogs in my lifetime.
Okay.
No, quite true. You know, kiosks in St. Petersburg at the time were kind of the place, kind of like the McDonald's, if you will, before there was really like lots of McDonald's in St. Petersburg. And I am confident that I probably ate one of those hot dogs. But then he converted that kiosk business into several very posh restaurants, most notably the old Customs House, which is one of his first big luxury restaurants. And Prigozhin loved to host Sobchak and Putin there. That was kind of their clubhouse. And that was the beginning. And then after that, he really did become essentially the caterer extraordinaire to Putin in the Kremlin. George Bush was one of his customers. Whenever Bush came to town with his wife Laura, there would always be a Prigozhin-made meal. He did G7 gatherings. I mean, he was really quite something. And I think his ability to kind of crash through any kind of obstacles that would get in the way, because food was quite scarce. Good food was very scarce in the 1990s in St. Petersburg. His ability to sort of magically make things happen, I think, very much endeared him to Putin.
And you may have sort of answered this already, but there was obviously a point where Prigozhin felt that he no longer wanted to be in the hands of Putin, or that he felt he could do a better job. Was that Bakhmut? Was that being on the front line? And as you say, sort of going a bit crazy, basically, deciding that he'd had enough and that he was the man he was going to take. Well, I don't know. Did he want Vladimir Putin's job? Did he get to that point?
I don't think he wanted Vladimir Putin's job. I do think what he wanted to do was petition the Tsar. And I do think that what he wanted to do was show that he was politically relevant at a time when he was becoming increasingly irrelevant. the more the Wagner Group came out of the shadows, the more the names of the commanders were known, the more their feats of wonder on the battlefield became sort of newsy, the less relevant he was, because that whole need for plausible deniability simply wasn't there anymore. And I think he understood very quickly the moment, I think, that really there was a big turning point. There are two, I'd say. One was in early 2023. You might remember this Wagner Group soldier who defected and ran across the border in the tundra, across into Norway, and said, Prigozhin has made me commit war crimes, these kinds of things. I think that was a turning point. It clearly was orchestrated, I think, with some help from insiders inside the Wagner Group. And then the second was, you'll remember this, a targeted assassination of a military blogger who was very close to Prigozhin in April of 2023. An explosion at a restaurant in St. Petersburg, right on the university embankment, which, by the way, happened to be Prigozhin's, one of his first restaurant openings was there. So it was a message, I think, then. Now, was it a message from Putin? Not necessarily. I think it was certainly a message from some of Prigozhin's rivals. So early, I'd say, I think he started to understand his political capital was fading, and without it, he might not survive.
What do we know of the plane crash that killed Prigozhin 2 months later? And it took a while for it to be confirmed that it was Prigozhin, and we're still not really sure what happened. I wonder if in the research of the book, you've been able to unearth anything about that.
Well, there are quite a few theories, of course, about what happened. And Putin, as you probably remember, said, they were busy, snorting cocaine and juggling grenades, and maybe something happened.
They said they found evidence of drugs, didn't they?
Yes, evidence of drugs. And actually, Prigozhin was known to be relatively clean. So he wasn't really, somebody who was known to have done drugs, per se, although he had a very volatile temper. So that's not obviously a plausible theory. Two theories out there. One is that there were two women who, about a week before the plane blew up, boarded the plane and said that they were going to buy it from him because, of course, he was having difficulty doing anything, even getting maintenance for the plane. And nobody has seen these two women. You could hear them talking as they film inside the cabin of this very luxurious, Hawker 800, beautiful plane, talking about, this will be lovely if we could just buy it. And then the second was there was something wrong with a part on the plane that they couldn't get replaced by the original company, Embraer. And so somebody has this theory that there was some tinkering, and that perhaps those women were a little bit of a distraction for the tinkering to happen. Again, nobody's been able to prove it, but I think it's pretty clear it was sabotage. And I think that, the theory that Nikolai Patrushev, the Kremlin advisor, longtime Kremlin advisor to Putin, was most likely the one who gave the green light to that.
What's the reach of the Wagner Group like now? We've been reporting in the Times this week, there's a trial at the Old Bailey at the moment, 2 British men behind a huge fire at a warehouse that was storing aid for Ukraine. They also, during the course of this trial, have admitted that they took money from the Wagner Group to blow up a Mayfair restaurant and a wine shop that was nearby, a wine store nearby, and kidnap the owner. What is the reach of the Wagner Group now?
Well, the Wagner Group brand, despite the fact that Prigozhin is gone now, still lives on. They still have a very popular Telegram channel, about 550,000 followers. And some of these young men who are now at trial most likely found their way to the Wagner Group through that channel, which is the gray zone. And they, of course, have been behind a number of different sabotage attacks in Poland, or at least connected to them. So the brand remains very potent, especially for young men who are disaffected, who are looking for a way to prove themselves and belong.
I think our listeners might be surprised to hear that the Wagner Group is reaching disaffected young men effectively, or disaffected men and women also here in the UK.
Yeah, well, it is surprising. And yet, even before Prigozhin died, we did a lot of studies on their social media presence. Prigozhin himself had a huge following, almost 500,000 on Telegram alone, just his own. But Wagner-affiliated channels ran into, 5 million followers just on Vkontakte, which is the Russian Facebook. That's extraordinary.
That's huge, yeah.
Extraordinary. For the platform at the time, it really represented a huge slice. If you can imagine maybe like 10% of Facebook following some sort of Wagner-branded channel, I mean, that's quite extraordinary. And, that became a playground. Vkontakte is a place where if you're a white supremacist or you're kind of extremist, particularly a fascist, it's a place where you can find your own people. And Wagner had plenty of presence there. And when we did some geocoding sort of analysis of, people who followed the Wagner Group on Vkontakte, it was extraordinary. Germany was number 3 after Ukraine. There were people in the United States, even members of the military, who followed Wagner closely. So really potent because there's a virulence to the violence. And I think that's something that really appeals to young, disaffected men.
You're in London following that trial, aren't you? Just tell us a little bit about that, or about your interest in this and your background.
Yeah, well, listen, I reported on cops and crime for over a decade in the United States, Florida, Maryland, Virginia. And so I've always just been very interested in crime in general. So it's interesting to be here in the UK to see how this court system works, which is totally different than the United States. But this is one of several cases that I've been following. I was also in Poland. There were 2 Russian men who were arrested for putting up Wagner Group recruitment stickers all over Krakow and Warsaw. But they had traveled to Paris to put up propaganda, Berlin. And this is all happening exactly at the time that Prigozhin is marching on Moscow. So this was already the beginning of a split. Some sort of clear intent by the GRU to rebrand and relabel the Wagner Group as something that could be used as a tool to attract people into these sabotage campaigns.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And a bit about where you're working now, because you've got a fascinating job. In fact, you seem to have lots of different jobs. But what is the main thing you do? And I suppose why Prigozhin? You've obviously say that you report on crime, but there must be something that has drawn you to this particular group, or even to consider the theory of how you topple Vladimir Putin or not.
Yes, it's true that I have too many jobs. If you'd like one, you can have one of them. So I'm a professor at Arizona State University, and I actually teach conflict studies there to a lot of folks who are actually transitioning in their career, many veterans. And then I also run a think tank program at New America, which is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington called Future Frontlines. And that's sort of, it's been the engine in many ways of the research on the Wagner Group. We really look at the way technology is changing the character of war and sort of helping people like Putin and Prigozhin bend the rules of international law. And so that's really been my focus for quite some time. I think a lot of my interest, as I say, comes from a childhood kind of growing up studying crime. My uncle was a crime scene cop, very influential in my life. But also, the connection between mafia and power and the abuse of power has long legs in history. And I think when you look at Prigozhin, you look at the Wagner Group, what you're seeing is potentially a very dangerous future that we're headed toward, where strongman dictatorship really use these proxies to bend the law. I thought it was important to write this book because at the end of the day, all wars are settled and accounting happens. And I think that there will be an accounting for the Wagner Group and Putin.
Can you topple Vladimir Putin? Assassination has been described as the only way that he can be deposed of office. Do you believe that too?
I believe that the sugar rush of this war will end. Whether there's a temporary ceasefire that's now on the table with Zelensky, or a longer-term frozen conflict, a la South Ossetia, or some of the other wars, I think at the end of the day, sustaining the war machine and the war economy will be very, very difficult for Vladimir Putin. And it's at that stage that either his health will get him or, the conflict amongst rivals who are tired of, having their slice of the pie taken from them will ultimately unseat him.
It's been so interesting speaking to you. Thank you. The book is called Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group and Russia's Collapse into Mercenary Chaos. And its author, Candace Rondeaux, has been with us. Thank you.
Thank you.